"Don't go inside!" The words erupted from my throat with such force that my husband stopped dead in his tracks on the front walkway. We were standing outside what had once been our dream home, a beautiful two-story colonial in suburban Connecticut that we'd purchased just 18 months earlier. But something was fundamentally wrong with this house, something that had been growing worse over the past 6 months, and every fiber of my being was screaming danger. "Margaret, what's gotten into you?" David asked, turning back to look at me with that mixture of concern and exasperation I'd been seeing more frequently lately. "It's our house. We've been living here for over a year." But I couldn't explain the dread that had been building inside me, the way the house seemed to shift and breathe when we weren't looking, the strange sounds that echoed through the walls at night, the way our utilities bills had been climbing despite our careful conservation efforts. I couldn't tell him about the dreams I'd been having, visions of fire and destruction that felt more like memories than imagination. What I did know was that 3 minutes later, our entire world would change forever, and David's decision to ignore my warning would cost us everything we'd worked 30 years to build together. Before we dive deeper into Margaret's story, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to our Stories channel. We're building a community of people who understand that sometimes the most ordinary moments can reveal extraordinary truths. Now, back to the story. My name is Margaret Collins, and I'm 61 years old. For the past 3 decades, I've worked as a medical technician at Hartford General Hospital, while my husband David has built a successful career as an electrical contractor. We raised 2 daughters in a modest ranch house across town, saving every penny we could for our retirement dream home. When we finally found the Colonial on Maple Street, with its wraparound porch and mature oak trees, it felt like destiny. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Washingtons, had lived there for 47 years before moving to assisted living. They'd maintained the property beautifully, and the inspection revealed only minor issues that David's expertise could easily handle. The price was reasonable, almost suspiciously so for a house of that size and condition in our area. But we attributed our good fortune to timing and the seller's urgency to relocate. The first few months were everything we'd hoped for. David threw himself into small renovation projects, updating fixtures and refreshing paint, while I spent hours planning our garden and arranging furniture in rooms that finally had enough space for all our belongings. Our daughters visited frequently, marveling at how their practical parents had finally indulged in something luxurious. Weekend barbecues on the back deck became a regular tradition, and we invited neighbors over to introduce ourselves to the community. Everything seemed perfect, almost dreamlike in its contentment. But perfection, I've learned, often masks underlying problems that only reveal themselves when it's too late to escape their consequences. The first sign something was wrong came during our 4th month in the house. I was working the night shift at the hospital when David called me at 2 a.m, his voice tight with confusion. "Margaret, I'm hearing something strange in the walls," he said, and I could hear genuine concern beneath his usual calm demeanor. "It sounds like water running, but I've checked every faucet, every toilet, every appliance. Nothing's on, but the sound won't stop." I suggested he call our plumber in the morning, thinking perhaps we had a small leak somewhere behind the drywall. But when David had 3 different contractors examine the plumbing system over the following weeks, they found nothing unusual. The pipes were in excellent condition. No leaks, no pressure issues, no explanation for the phantom water sounds that David continued to hear at random intervals. Then came the electrical anomalies. As a licensed electrician with over 25 years of experience, David knew house wiring better than most people know their own reflection. But our home's electrical system seemed to defy everything he understood about current flow and circuit behavior. Lights would flicker in patterns that suggested overloaded circuits, yet our electrical panel showed normal readings. Appliances would trip breakers for no apparent reason, sometimes multiple times in a single day. But when David tested the circuits, everything measured within acceptable parameters. Most disturbing were the power fluctuations that occurred exactly every 72 hours, causing brief outages that lasted precisely 6 minutes before power restored itself automatically. David spent entire weekends tracing wiring, checking connections, and consulting with colleagues, but nobody could explain why our electrical system behaved like it was controlled by some invisible force following its own mysterious schedule. Our utility bills began climbing steadily during our 6th month in the house, despite our conscious efforts to reduce consumption. We'd replaced old appliances with energy-efficient models, installed programmable thermostats, and switched to LED lighting throughout. Yet our monthly electric bill doubled, then tripled, reaching amounts that seemed impossible for a household of 2 people who were rarely home during peak hours. When I called the utility company to dispute the charges, they sent technicians to verify our meter readings. The meter was functioning correctly, they assured me, and the consumption data matched exactly what they were billing us for. Perhaps you have equipment running that you're not aware of, the supervisor suggested. Sometimes people have workshops or hobby rooms with high-draw equipment they forget about. But David and I had accounted for every electrical device in our home, and the math simply didn't add up to the massive power consumption our bills reflected. The situation escalated during our 7th month, when I began experiencing what I can only describe as premonitory dreams. These weren't ordinary nightmares, but vivid, detailed visions that felt more real than my waking hours. Night after night, I would dream of standing in our living room, watching flames spread across the ceiling with impossible speed, while the walls seemed to melt around me. The dreams always followed the same sequence. First, a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from beneath the house, then a bright flash of light, followed by an explosion that reduced our beautiful home to smoldering rubble in minutes. I would wake gasping, my heart racing, the smell of smoke so strong in my nostrils that I'd run through the house checking every room for signs of fire. David would find me in the kitchen at 3 a.m, still shaking, trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced was just anxiety manifesting in my sleep. Maybe we should talk to someone about these dreams, he suggested gently, his face creased with worry. The stress of the new house, the strange problems we've been having, it's probably just your mind trying to process everything. But deep down, I knew these visions weren't products of stress or imagination. They felt like warnings, urgent messages from some part of my consciousness that understood dangers my rational mind couldn't yet comprehend. The dreams became more frequent and detailed as autumn progressed. I began keeping a journal beside my bed, recording every element I could remember upon waking. The consistency was disturbing. The same rumbling sound, the same flash of light, the same pattern of destruction. More troubling was how the dreams seemed to be showing me increasingly specific details about the explosion's cause. In my visions, I could see David walking toward the basement stairs, reaching for the light switch at the top of the staircase, his hand making contact with the metal plate. That moment always triggered the catastrophic sequence that followed, as if his simple action was the final catalyst in a chain reaction that had been building for months. I tried describing these details to David, hoping he might understand why I'd become so anxious about certain areas of the house. But he interpreted my concerns as general worry about our electrical problems rather than specific warnings about imminent danger. Meanwhile, the house's behavioral anomalies continued to intensify. The phantom water sounds grew louder and more frequent, sometimes accompanied by what sounded like conversation or movement from rooms we knew were empty. David began setting up recording equipment to capture these sounds, thinking perhaps we could identify their source if we could analyze them objectively. But the recordings revealed only silence, even during moments when we were both clearly hearing disturbances. Either this equipment is malfunctioning or something is interfering with its ability to record what we're experiencing, David concluded after reviewing hours of blank audio. The electrical problems also worsened, with power fluctuations occurring daily instead of every 3 days, and the duration of outages extending from 6 minutes to 15, then 30. Our home seemed to be developing its own rhythm, its own schedule of disruption that followed no logical pattern David could decipher. The financial strain of our escalating utility bills forced us to consider drastic measures. Our monthly electric bill had reached nearly $800, an amount that consumed most of David's discretionary income and forced us to dip into our retirement savings. "We need to call the utility company again," I insisted during one of our increasingly tense dinner conversations. "There has to be some explanation for why we're using 10 times more electricity than any comparable household in our neighborhood." David had already contacted them multiple times, each conversation ending with the same response. Their equipment was functioning correctly, our consumption was accurately measured, and perhaps we should consider hiring an energy efficiency consultant to identify problems with our home's systems. The consultant we eventually hired spent an entire day examining our house, testing appliances, checking insulation, and measuring heat loss. His final report concluded that our home was actually more energy efficient than average, and should be consuming significantly less power than typical houses of similar size and age. As winter approached, I became increasingly convinced that we needed to leave the house, at least temporarily, until we could understand what was happening. The dreams were occurring almost nightly now, and they'd begun showing me additional disturbing details. I could see newspapers scattered on our front lawn with headlines about gas explosions and utility accidents. I could see emergency vehicles lining our street, their red and blue lights reflecting off the faces of neighbors standing behind yellow tape. Most chilling was the recurring image of David's tool belt lying in the rubble, scorched but recognizable, suggesting that he'd been inside the house when the explosion occurred. "We need to stay somewhere else for a while," I told David one evening as we sat in our living room, the same room where I'd watched countless dream fires consume everything we owned. "Maybe with Rebecca, until we can figure out what's wrong with this place." Our daughter Rebecca lived about 20 miles away and had already expressed concern about the problems we'd been experiencing. But David, practical and stubborn as always, couldn't accept the idea of abandoning our dream home because of what he considered mechanical problems that had logical solutions. "Margaret, we've invested everything in this house," he said, gesturing around the room we decorated so carefully. "Our entire retirement plan is tied up in this property. We can't just walk away because of some electrical issues and your bad dreams." I understood his perspective, appreciated his logical approach to problem solving, but logic felt inadequate when confronted with the growing certainty that our house was building towards some catastrophic event. The dreams weren't just showing me destruction anymore. They were showing me the precise moment when that destruction would begin, and David's stubborn determination to solve our problems through conventional means was placing him directly in harm's way. The final warning came on a gray December morning when I woke from the most vivid dream yet. This time, I hadn't just witnessed the explosion. I'd experienced it from David's perspective, feeling his confusion as he reached for the basement light switch, sensing his split-second realization that something was fundamentally wrong with the electrical system, sharing his terror as the house erupted around him. The dream had been so realistic that I could still feel the heat on my face and taste smoke in my mouth as I sat up in bed, checking the clock to find it was only 4:30 in the morning. David was sleeping peacefully beside me, unaware that I'd just experienced what felt like a preview of his death. I slipped out of bed and walked through our house, examining every room with new eyes, searching for physical signs of the dangers my subconscious mind kept showing me. The basement drew my attention with unusual intensity, and as I stood at the top of the stairs looking down into the darkness, I noticed something I'd never observed before: a faint, electrical humming sound, barely audible but constant, coming from somewhere below our main floor. That morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in over 2 years, unable to concentrate on anything except the growing conviction that our house was about to become a crime scene. I spent the day researching house explosions, gas leaks, electrical fires, and utility accidents, looking for patterns that might explain what I was experiencing. What I discovered was deeply unsettling. Houses built during the same era as ours had experienced a small but significant number of catastrophic failures related to outdated electrical systems interacting with modern high-efficiency appliances. In several documented cases, the combination of old wiring and new technology had created feedback loops that overloaded circuits in ways that standard safety equipment couldn't detect or prevent. The electrical surges would build gradually over months, creating conditions that eventually triggered explosive failures when specific combinations of factors aligned. Reading these reports felt like reviewing my own dreams, the technical descriptions matching exactly what my subconscious had been showing me night after night. When David returned from work that evening, I showed him the research I'd compiled, pointing out similarities between our situation and the documented cases I'd found. "Look at this," I said, spreading printouts across our kitchen table. "The electrical fluctuations, The unexplained power consumption, the timing of the problems starting after we moved in and began using our new appliances. This isn't random mechanical failure. It's a systematic buildup toward a predictable catastrophic event. David examined the documentation with the same methodical attention he brought to troubleshooting electrical problems, and I could see him beginning to understand the connections I was drawing. These cases involved houses built between 1968 and 1975, he said slowly, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when working through complex technical problems. Our house was built in 1971. The timing was exactly right, the symptoms were identical, and the progression matched what we'd been experiencing for months. We need to contact the utility company immediately and request an emergency inspection, I said, feeling hopeful for the first time in weeks that we'd identified a specific, actionable problem. If there's a systematic issue with houses from this era, they must have protocols for dealing with it. But when David called the utility company the next morning, he encountered the same bureaucratic indifference we'd experienced before. The customer service representative listened politely to his explanation, but insisted that their standard inspection procedures were adequate for identifying any safety hazards. If your house had dangerous electrical problems, our routine inspections would have detected them, she explained, with the patient tone reserved for customers who think they understand technical issues better than trained professionals. The fluctuations you're describing are within normal parameters for homes with high electrical demand. No amount of explanation about the research I'd compiled or the specific patterns we'd identified could convince them to schedule an emergency evaluation. Frustrated by the utility company's response, David decided to conduct his own comprehensive inspection of our electrical system, starting with the basement where I'd noticed the unusual humming sound. He spent an entire Saturday mapping every circuit, testing every connection, and measuring voltage levels throughout the house. What he discovered confirmed our worst fears. The electrical system was operating far outside safe parameters, with current loads that should have triggered circuit breakers but somehow weren't registering on the safety equipment. The wiring behind our main panel is carrying nearly twice the current it was designed to handle, he told me that evening, his face pale with the implications of what he'd found. The insulation on some of the old cables is deteriorating, and there are multiple points where different generations of wiring have been spliced together without proper junction boxes. The situation was far more dangerous than we'd realized, and the fact that our circuit breakers weren't responding appropriately meant that standard safety systems couldn't protect us from the growing electrical instability. "We need to shut off the main breaker and call an emergency electrician immediately," I said, but David was already shaking his head. "If we shut off the main breaker now, we might trigger exactly the kind of surge that causes these houses to explode," he replied. "The electrical system has reached a state of equilibrium that's unstable but functional. Disrupting that equilibrium without proper preparation could be more dangerous than leaving it alone." He explained that several of the documented cases had involved explosions triggered by well-meaning homeowners who'd attempted to shut off their electrical systems without understanding the complex feedback loops they'd created. "We need professional help, but we need to be extremely careful about how we approach this." The irony was devastating. Our house had become an electrical bomb, but the very act of trying to defuse it could trigger the explosion we were trying to prevent. David's plan was methodical and cautious, reflecting his decades of experience with complex electrical systems. He would contact specialized contractors who dealt specifically with vintage electrical problems, explain our situation in detail, and arrange for them to assess our system before taking any corrective action. "This isn't something we can rush," he explained as we sat in our kitchen that Saturday evening, both of us acutely aware that we were surrounded by walls filled with potentially lethal electrical hazards. One wrong move, one circuit opened or closed at the wrong moment, and we could trigger exactly what we're trying to prevent. I understood his reasoning, appreciated his professional caution, but the dreams were becoming more urgent and specific with each passing night. They were no longer showing me generic explosions, but precise sequences of events, exact timing, specific details about how the catastrophe would unfold. In my most recent visions, I could see the calendar on our kitchen wall, and the date was always the same, December 18th, just 6 days away. The next few days passed in a surreal state of suspended tension. David made appointments with 3 different electrical contractors who specialized in historical home problems, but none of them could schedule emergency consultations before the following week. Emergency calls for electrical issues usually involve immediate safety hazards like sparking outlets or burning smells, one contractor's scheduler explained. Preventive inspections, even urgent ones, get scheduled during regular business hours. The bureaucratic impossibility of getting immediate professional help for a problem that might kill us within days highlighted how isolated we'd become in our dangerous situation. Friends and family members, when we tried to explain our concerns, invariably suggested obvious solutions like calling the fire department or simply moving to a hotel until the problems were resolved. But David's research had shown that evacuating the house without proper electrical shutdown procedures could actually trigger the explosive failure we were trying to avoid. Meanwhile, I was struggling to maintain normal routines while living with the constant awareness that our house was essentially a sophisticated time bomb. Going to work became almost impossible because I couldn't concentrate on anything except counting hours until December 18th. Sleeping was even worse because the dreams were now showing me additional details I hadn't seen before. The exact time of day when the explosion would occur, 11:47 in the morning. The specific weather conditions, overcast with light snow. And most disturbingly, the reason David would be in the basement when it happened. In every vision, he was going downstairs to reset a circuit breaker that had tripped while he was trying to make coffee, a routine task he'd performed dozens of times since we'd been experiencing electrical problems. The mundane nature of the trigger made it feel both inevitable and preventable, as if fate was offering us one last chance to recognize the danger and step away from it. By December 16th, my anxiety had reached levels that made normal conversation nearly impossible. David noticed my increasing agitation, but attributed it to stress about our electrical problems rather than specific premonitions about when those problems would culminate in disaster. "Margaret, you need to try to relax about this," he said gently, as we ate dinner in our kitchen. The same kitchen I'd seen destroyed countless times in my dreams. "We've identified the problem, we have professionals coming to help us, and we're taking all reasonable precautions. Worrying about worst-case scenarios isn't going to change anything." But I couldn't explain that I wasn't worrying about worst-case scenarios. I was remembering future events that felt as real and inevitable as yesterday's memories. The dreams had evolved beyond warnings into what seemed like previews of an unalterable timeline that would unfold regardless of our attempts to prevent it. That night, I made a decision that probably saved both our lives. Instead of going to bed and subjecting myself to another night of prophetic nightmares, I decided to stay awake and keep watch over our house, monitoring for any signs of the electrical instability David had identified. I positioned myself in our living room with a clear view of the basement door, determined to prevent David from going downstairs, no matter what electrical problems might occur during the night. The house seemed to sense my vigilance, remaining unnaturally quiet through the early morning hours, as if it understood that I was prepared to interfere with whatever sequence of events it had been building toward. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the familiar electrical humming from the basement grow noticeably louder, accompanied by a new sound that resembled distant thunder, but seemed to be coming from below our foundation rather than from the sky above. As dawn approached on December 17th, I realized that staying awake had given me a different perspective on our house's behavioral patterns. The electrical fluctuations weren't random. They followed a precise schedule that was building towards some kind of climactic event. Every few hours, the humming would intensify. The lights would flicker in specific patterns, and then everything would return to its baseline level of instability. But each cycle was slightly more intense than the previous one, suggesting that whatever was happening in our electrical system was approaching some kind of threshold or breaking point. By monitoring these cycles through the night, I began to understand that our house wasn't just experiencing electrical problems. It was following a countdown sequence that would reach its conclusion sometime within the next 24 hours. The precision of the timing matched exactly what my dreams had been showing me, confirming that December 18th would indeed be the day when months of electrical instability finally triggered the catastrophic failure I'd been witnessing in my sleep. December 18th dawned gray and cold, with light snow beginning to fall exactly as my dreams had predicted. I had managed only a few hours of restless sleep, waking repeatedly to check the time and ensure that David wasn't moving around the house in ways that might trigger the sequence of events I'd seen so many times in my nightmares. When David got up at his usual 6:30, I was already awake, watching him with an intensity that made him pause at the bedroom doorway. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked, noticing my haggard appearance and anxious demeanor. "You look like you haven't slept at all." I tried to explain that I'd been monitoring our electrical situation through the night, that the patterns were intensifying, that something significant was going to happen today, but the words sounded like paranoid rambling even to my own ears. How could I tell him that I'd spent months experiencing detailed visions of his death without sounding like I was having some kind of psychological breakdown? Throughout the morning, I shadowed David's movements around the house, finding excuses to be in whatever room he was occupying, ready to prevent him from going near the basement stairs. My behavior was obviously abnormal, and David's concern for my mental state was becoming more apparent with each passing hour. "Margaret, I think we should call Dr. Peterson," he said as we sat in the kitchen drinking coffee, referring to my primary care physician. "You've been under tremendous stress about this house situation, and I'm worried that it's affecting your health." But I couldn't let medical concerns distract us from the immediate danger that was building with each passing minute. The electrical humming from the basement was now audible throughout the house, and the lights had been flickering almost continuously since dawn. Our situation was clearly deteriorating rapidly, yet David seemed focused on my psychological well-being rather than the obvious signs that our electrical system was approaching catastrophic failure. At 11:15, exactly 32 minutes before the time I'd seen repeatedly in my dreams, our coffee maker suddenly stopped working. David got up to check the circuit breaker in the kitchen, but that breaker was functioning normally. "It must be the basement breaker panel," he said, already heading toward the basement stairs. "I'll just run down and reset whatever circuit controls the kitchen appliances." This was the exact scenario my dreams had shown me, the precise sequence of events that always led to the explosion. I jumped up from my chair and positioned myself between David and the basement door, my heart racing with the certainty that I was about to witness the culmination of months of prophetic warnings. "Don't go down there," I said, my voice shaking with urgency. "Please, David, just leave it alone for now." But David looked at me with growing concern, clearly believing that my anxiety about our electrical problems had reached irrational levels. "Margaret, it's just a circuit breaker," he said gently, trying to move around me toward the stairs. "I've reset dozens of them since we've been having these problems. It takes 30 seconds, and then we'll have our coffee maker working again." The reasonableness of his explanation, the mundane nature of the task, made my fears seem absurd even to myself. But I couldn't forget the vividness of my dreams, the precise details that had been proven accurate, the unshakable conviction that David's hand touching that basement light switch would trigger a chain reaction that would destroy everything. "Something terrible is going to happen if you go down there," I insisted, grabbing his arm to physically prevent him from reaching the basement door. "I can't explain how I know, but I know. Please trust me on this." David stopped and really looked at me then, seeing the genuine terror in my eyes, the absolute certainty that I was trying to prevent a catastrophe rather than simply expressing general anxiety. For a moment he hesitated, caught between his practical need to solve our immediate problem and his recognition that my fears, however irrational they might seem, were based on months of accurate observations about our house's dangerous behavior. "What exactly do you think is going to happen?" he asked, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when dealing with potentially unstable situations. I tried to explain about the dreams, the consistent timing, the specific sequence of events that always began with him reaching for the basement light switch, but the explanation sounded like the ravings of someone who'd lost touch with reality. "I know how this sounds," I said desperately, "but every detail I've seen in these dreams has turned out to be accurate. The electrical problems, the timing, the weather today, everything has happened exactly as I've been seeing it for months." David studied my face intently, weighing my emotional state against his practical assessment of the situation. At 11:43, 4 minutes before the explosion time from my dreams, David made a decision that saved both our lives. Instead of dismissing my concerns as psychological symptoms or pushing past me to reach the basement, He stepped back from the stairs and wrapped his arms around me. "Okay," he said quietly. "I don't understand what's happening, but I trust you. If you believe something terrible will happen if I go down there, then I won't go down there." The relief that flooded through me was so intense that my knees nearly buckled, but I remained tense, watching the kitchen clock as it approached 11:47. We stood together in our kitchen, holding each other, while I counted down the seconds to the time when my dreams had always shown destruction beginning. 11:46 passed, then 11:47, then 11:48, and nothing happened. The house continued its electrical humming. The lights continued their irregular flickering, but no explosion erupted from the basement to consume our home. For several minutes after 11:47 passed without incident, I felt a mixture of relief and confusion that left me emotionally drained, but grateful that my months of terrifying dreams had apparently been wrong about the specific timing. David continued holding me in our kitchen, but I could sense his growing puzzlement about why I'd been so convinced that this particular moment would bring disaster. "Maybe the dreams were warnings that helped us avoid the problem," I suggested weakly, trying to understand why the precise timing had been incorrect while everything else had matched my visions perfectly. "Maybe by not going to the basement, you changed the outcome." But even as I spoke, I realized that something fundamental was still wrong with our house, that the electrical instability hadn't disappeared simply because we'd passed the deadline from my nightmares. The humming from the basement was actually growing louder, and the light flickering had become so constant that our kitchen resembled a strobe light display. At 11:52, our phone rang with an urgency that made both of us jump. David answered to find our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, calling from her cell phone, her voice high with excitement and concern. "David, there are utility trucks all over our street," she said rapidly. "They're telling everyone to evacuate their houses immediately. Something about dangerous electrical conditions in homes built during the early 1970s. David's face went pale as he processed this information, realizing that our individual crisis was actually part of a larger systematic problem affecting multiple houses in our neighborhood. "They're going door to door checking basements and electrical panels," Mrs. Patterson continued. "One of the technicians told me that several houses in this area are at risk of catastrophic electrical failure. You and Margaret need to get out of your house right now." David thanked her and hung up, then turned to me with an expression that mixed vindication of my concerns with alarm about our immediate situation. "We need to leave the house immediately," he said, already moving toward our bedroom to gather essential items. "If the utility company is conducting emergency evacuations, our situation is even more dangerous than we realized." But as we quickly packed an overnight bag with medications, important documents, and basic necessities, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still following the script from my dreams, just with slightly different timing. The evacuation felt like the natural progression of events I'd been witnessing for months, as if the dreams had been showing me the outcome rather than the precise schedule. We were gathering our belongings with the same urgency I'd seen in my visions, preparing to flee from a house that had become uninhabitable due to electrical hazards we couldn't control or predict. The only difference was that professional help had arrived to guide our evacuation instead of forcing us to make the decision entirely on our own. As we carried our hastily packed bags toward the front door, I paused for one final look at the home we'd loved for 18 months, the rooms we'd decorated so carefully, the space where we'd planned to spend our retirement years. Everything looked normal in the gray morning light filtering through our windows, but I could hear the electrical humming that had become the soundtrack of our daily lives, reminding me that beneath the surface appearance of domestic tranquility, our house was fundamentally unstable and potentially lethal. "I'm sorry we have to leave," David said softly, following my gaze around our living room. "I know how much this place meant to you." But I realized that my attachment to the house had been completely severed by months of living with the constant awareness that it might kill us. The beautiful rooms and carefully chosen furnishings meant nothing compared to the relief I felt about finally escaping the electrical time bomb we'd been calling home. When we stepped outside onto our front porch, the scene on Maple Street was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in our quiet suburban neighborhood. Utility trucks lined both sides of the road, their warning lights flashing in patterns that reminded me of the electrical fluctuations we'd been experiencing inside our house. Technicians wearing protective equipment were moving systematically from house to house, carrying detection equipment and speaking into radio headsets with the urgency of people dealing with multiple simultaneous emergencies. Our neighbors were standing in small groups on the sidewalk, many of them holding hastily packed bags and looking confused about why they'd been forced to evacuate their homes with minimal explanation. The scale of the operation suggested that our electrical problems weren't isolated incidents, but part of a widespread infrastructure failure that posed immediate dangers to dozens of families. A utility supervisor approached us as we locked our front door, his expression grave with the weight of delivering potentially devastating news. "Mr. and Mrs. Collins, I'm afraid your house is one of several in this area that we've identified as having critical electrical hazards," he explained, consulting a tablet that displayed what appeared to be technical readings from various properties. The wiring systems in homes built during the early 1970s have been interacting with modern electrical appliances in ways that create dangerous feedback loops. Your house specifically shows readings that indicate imminent catastrophic failure of the electrical system. David asked about the timeline for repairs, whether we'd be able to return home within days or weeks, but the supervisor's response eliminated any hope of quick resolution. "I'm sorry, but houses with readings like yours typically require complete electrical system replacement, and that's only if the underlying structure hasn't been compromised by electrical damage." The financial implications hit us both simultaneously as we processed what the supervisor was telling us. Complete electrical system replacement would cost tens of thousands of dollars, potentially more than our house was worth, and that assumed the structure itself was salvageable. Our retirement savings, our equity in the property, our entire financial security was tied up in a house that had apparently become uninhabitable due to infrastructure problems beyond our control or prediction. "What about insurance coverage for this type of problem?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Unfortunately, most homeowners' insurance policies don't cover electrical system failures unless they result from specific covered events like lightning strikes, the supervisor replied. Infrastructure deterioration and appliance compatibility issues are typically considered maintenance problems rather than insurable disasters. Standing on the sidewalk outside our evacuated home, watching utility workers prepare to disconnect our electrical service permanently, I felt a strange sense of closure about the months of dreams and premonitions that had led us to this moment. The explosion I'd witnessed repeatedly in my sleep hadn't occurred because we'd been forced to evacuate before the electrical system reached its final breaking point, but everything else about my visions had been accurately prophetic. Our house had indeed become uninhabitable due to electrical hazards. Our financial security had been destroyed, and we were facing the complete loss of everything we'd worked 30 years to achieve. The dreams hadn't been psychological symptoms or stress responses. They'd been warnings about the inevitable outcome of problems that were too complex and dangerous for us to solve on our own. My subconscious mind had somehow recognized patterns and dangers that our conscious awareness couldn't process, providing us with months of advance notice about a crisis that professional experts were only now beginning to understand and address. David spent the next hour discussing technical details with the utility supervisors, trying to understand exactly what had gone wrong with our electrical system and whether there might be any options for repair or remediation. What he learned was both fascinating and terrifying from an engineering perspective. Houses built during the early 1970s had used electrical components and wiring methods that were state-of-the-art for their time, but couldn't handle the electrical demands and characteristics of modern appliances and electronics. Over time, the interaction between old and new technology had created feedback loops that gradually destabilized the electrical systems, causing them to operate outside safe parameters while appearing normal on standard diagnostic equipment. It's like having a car engine that runs fine for months while slowly destroying itself internally, one of the technicians explained. By the time symptoms become obvious, the damage is too extensive for simple repairs. The most chilling revelation was that several houses in our area had already experienced catastrophic electrical failures, including 2 that had resulted in fires and 1 that had exploded exactly as I'd seen in my dreams. "You're fortunate that we identified your house before it reached that point," the supervisor told us. Based on our readings, your electrical system was probably within days or possibly hours of complete failure. The timing aligned perfectly with my dream schedule, suggesting that my subconscious had somehow calculated the progression toward disaster more accurately than any technical analysis. Over the following weeks, the true scope of the electrical crisis in our neighborhood became clear. 37 houses built during the early 1970s required immediate evacuation, and 16 of them were eventually condemned as too dangerous to repair. The utility company faced massive liability issues and implemented emergency assistance programs for displaced residents. But the financial compensation was far less than what most families needed to rebuild their lives. David and I were fortunate compared to many of our neighbors because we had substantial retirement savings and could afford temporary housing while we decided what to do next. Some families, particularly young couples with children and limited resources, found themselves essentially homeless with no clear path forward. The legal battles that followed consumed months of our lives and most of our remaining financial resources. While the utility company accepted responsibility for the infrastructure problems, they argued that individual homeowners should have recognized the warning signs and sought professional help sooner. Our insurance company denied coverage as expected, claiming that the electrical deterioration constituted a maintenance issue rather than a covered disaster. We joined a class action lawsuit with other affected families, but the legal process moved slowly while our temporary housing costs continued mounting month after month. David, devastated by the loss of our dream home and the apparent end of our retirement plans, began talking about returning to work despite being 63 years old and ready to enjoy the fruits of 3 decades of careful saving and planning. But something unexpected emerged from the disaster that changed our perspective entirely. The temporary housing we'd found was a small apartment in a senior community about 15 miles from our old neighborhood, and we quickly discovered that downsized living had advantages we'd never considered. Without a large house to maintain, we had more time for activities we'd always postponed. Without the constant stress of electrical problems and utility bills, we slept better and enjoyed each other's company more. Our modest apartment cost a fraction of what our dream house had consumed in mortgage payments, utility bills, and maintenance expenses, leaving us with discretionary income for travel and hobbies we'd thought were impossible on our retirement budget. After 6 months in temporary housing, we realized we didn't want to rebuild our old lifestyle even if we could afford to do so. The resolution of our story came 18 months after that gray December morning, when we'd fled our home carrying overnight bags and no clear plan for the future. The class action lawsuit eventually resulted in a settlement that covered about 60% of our financial losses, enough to establish a solid foundation for a different kind of retirement than we'd originally planned. Instead of rebuilding in the same area where electrical infrastructure remained questionable, we used the settlement money as a down payment on a small condominium in a retirement community that provided maintenance services, recreational facilities, and social opportunities we'd never had in our isolated suburban neighborhood. The condo was less than half the size of our old house, but it was modern, efficient, and completely safe, with electrical systems designed specifically for contemporary appliances and lifestyle demands. David found unexpected satisfaction in consulting work that utilized his electrical expertise to help other families avoid the problems we'd experienced. The utility company hired him as part of their inspection team, identifying houses with dangerous electrical conditions before they reached catastrophic failure points. His first-hand experience with the warning signs and progression of electrical deterioration made him uniquely qualified to recognize similar problems in other homes. The work gave him a sense of purpose that retirement leisure activities had never provided, and the consulting fees supplemented our income enough to make our reduced living situation not just comfortable, but actually more prosperous than our previous lifestyle had been. "I'm helping prevent other families from going through what we experienced," he told me after his first month of consulting work. "It feels like something positive came out of all that chaos and uncertainty." My own perspective on the entire experience evolved gradually, from trauma to gratitude, as I realized how much we'd gained by being forced to abandon our original retirement plans. The dreams that had terrified me for months now seemed like an incredible gift, a warning system that had saved our lives and guided us toward a better way of living. Without those premonitions, we might have stayed in our dangerous house until it actually exploded, potentially killing us both and certainly destroying any chance of financial recovery. The visions had forced me to pay attention to subtle warning signs that rational analysis might have dismissed, ultimately leading to our evacuation before catastrophic failure occurred. Instead of viewing my prophetic dreams as psychological symptoms or supernatural phenomena, I began understanding them as evidence of my mind's ability to process complex information and recognize patterns that conscious reasoning couldn't detect. The social aspects of our new community also provided unexpected benefits that our isolated suburban lifestyle had never offered. Living among other retirees facing similar challenges and transitions gave us perspective on our own situation and introduced us to people who'd navigated major life changes successfully. Our neighbors included couples who'd lost homes to natural disasters, people who'd been forced to relocate due to health issues, and individuals who'd chosen to downsize for financial or practical reasons. Their stories helped us understand that major life disruptions, while traumatic when they occur, often lead to discoveries about what's truly important and what's merely habitual. We thought we needed that big house and all the space, I reflected during one of our evening walks around the community. But what we actually needed was security, companionship, and freedom from constant worry about maintenance and expenses. Perhaps most importantly, our experience taught us about the difference between planning for retirement and being prepared for life's unpredictable challenges. We'd saved diligently, purchased what seemed like the perfect home, and followed all conventional advice about preparing for our later years. But we'd never considered how quickly external circumstances beyond our control could disrupt our carefully constructed plans. The electrical crisis had forced us to discover resources and adaptability we didn't know we possessed, proving that financial preparation was less important than psychological flexibility and willingness to embrace unexpected changes. Our current lifestyle, while dramatically different from what we'd originally envisioned, was actually more sustainable and enjoyable than our previous arrangement had been. 3 years later, when I occasionally drive past our old neighborhood, I'm struck by how little attachment I feel to the house we once considered our dream home. The property has been completely rebuilt with modern electrical systems and is now occupied by a young family who presumably have no idea about the dangerous infrastructure problems that once made it uninhabitable. The street looks peaceful and prosperous, giving no indication of the crisis that displaced dozens of families and destroyed millions of dollars worth of property. But I know that beneath the surface appearance of suburban tranquility, infrastructure systems throughout the area remain vulnerable to the same technological incompatibilities that created our emergency. Other families living in houses built during the same era may be experiencing the same subtle warning signs we initially ignored, the same gradual progression toward electrical instability that my dreams eventually forced me to recognize. That's my story of how prophetic dreams and a husband's willingness to trust his wife's inexplicable certainty saved us from disaster and ultimately led us to a better life than we'd originally planned. Sometimes, the most frightening experiences reveal truths about what's truly necessary for happiness and security. Sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted creates space for discovering what you actually need. And sometimes the most important words you'll ever speak are the ones that seem completely irrational in the moment, but save lives when someone trusts you enough to listen. I'd love to hear your thoughts about trusting instincts that contradict logical reasoning. Have you ever experienced premonitions or warnings that seemed impossible to explain, but turned out to be accurate? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories about how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances.